So, welcome to TheDustyFeet.com, because this is a place where we can safely explore the endless ways of God and the interconnection of His creation, where belief understandings, they may be challenged, divine misunderstandings, they may exist in traditional teachings, they just might falter as we pursue connection, context, and community with God and each other here in an environment of grace and love. So, feel free to journey around the space. Explore. We have many different topics for discussion. Outside the class, Sons of the Father, the Bible Project, Aleph Beta, Follow the Red String, and more. So lend your ear, then lend your voice. Join a conversation, start a conversation, ask questions. Because on this journey, you're probably around folks that just might be pondering the same thing. Community that can build and connect. So come in and join us. And welcome to The Dusty Feet. Good evening. It's May 25th, 2023. Welcome to another one of our branches on the vine with our continuing series about how to view the Bible. This is part 8. We'll be discussing biblical narrative design patterns, right? We're using the videos from the Bible Project as our launch point. So we'll continue from there, see where it takes us. And good evening. And again, welcome to the Dusty Feet. In the description below are links to all of the audio, video, and source documents that we use here in the Dusty Feet. We want to make sure that any material we use here is properly credited to those folks who work so hard to bring it to us. Without their efforts, the learning we do here does not happen. And remember, on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe and click that bell icon if you want a reminder. Again, like we've mentioned each week on this series, we're going to start with addressing these expectations. One, this is not a definitive you shall do this. It just hopefully is a way one might opt to look at things. Two, this is a series, so there will be no one-line answers. Actually, many episodes with different responses and different options. Three, please give grace as each person learns more about this wonderful collection of scrolls. We call it the Bible. Four, again, this will be a series that builds on itself, so there's an expectation that one would have listened to the previous episodes, keep things in context. Remember, we're building here. And five, through this series, I will probably have a few points where I have a differing opinion from Tim and John. But by no means am I saying that they are wrong, just have a differing view on some things, right? Because I have nothing but the highest honor and respect for those two and all the work that they do at the Bible Project. Cool? I also want to continue to remind y'all of the podcast from Rabbi David Fohrman and those wonderful folks at Aleph Beta, a book like no other. Because he too is continuing to remind his audience that these are important elements to really grasp in Torah. I'm not really surprised at that. For those interested in the podcast from the Rabbi, link is in the description below. So for tonight, let's continue the journey with the next video, Biblical Narrative Design Patterns. Enjoy!
We've been exploring how biblical narratives work, and it turns out stories in the Bible are like any other story. You've got to pay attention to the characters, the setting, and the plot.
Yeah, these are the basic tools an author uses to help readers see the meaning and significance of the events. Now, it's time to learn one final skill that will bring all these elements together: how to detect design patterns in biblical narrative.
What do you mean by design patterns?
Well, the biblical authors have shaped all these elements, character, setting, and plot, to create series of repeated patterns that weave through story after story and tie them all together. When you notice these patterns, you'll see how different stories across the whole Bible have been coordinated to emphasize key themes.
This sounds interesting, but how do you know how to find a biblical pattern?
Well, biblical authors do it subtly. The best way to catch on is to watch them embed key words and images that link stories together. Take, for example, one of the main themes of the Bible, the complex and tragic human condition.
Okay.
So let's start at the beginning, where God is making a really good world.
Right, 7 times it says God saw that it was good.
So those are clearly important words. Now watch. God appoints 2 characters named Human and Life to rule this world on his behalf, and they're told that everything is good for them to eat.
Except for the tree of knowing good and evil.
So then the humans doubt God, and in Genesis we read, they see that it's good to take this knowledge for themselves. Then we read, they desire to become wise, and then finally, they take what they want.
And everything falls apart. This story is about the human condition.
And on its own, it's a really powerful story, but the biblical authors don't leave it there. They turn it into a pattern. It happens again with Abraham and Sarah. God brings them into the promised land, promises them a child. But they don't trust God, they get impatient, and we read the same words. They see their Egyptian slave, they take her and do what is good in their eyes. You get it?
Yeah, the stories match.
Then you get to Aaron at Mount Sinai, and we read how he sees and then takes the gold of the Israelites to make the golden calf. Or there's the story about Achan, who sees the gold of the Canaanites. He desires it and takes it for himself.
This pattern highlights how one person's temptation can create suffering for many people.
Exactly. It's just like the story of Saul, where we read that the Israelites see him. They desire him and take him as their king so they can be like all the other nations.
And Saul's reign leads them to destruction.
Or there's the story of David, which says that he sees Bathsheba, he desires her and then takes her and then kills her husband.
And then David's family starts destroying each other.
So you see, it's just one basic theme repeated over and over. These stories are all designed to show the temptation pattern.
Which is kind of a downer.
But the repetition builds up anticipation. Perhaps someone will come and break the pattern. This is why the stories of Jesus have been designed to carry the patterns forward to their climax.
Really?
Yeah, like what does Jesus say when he's faced with his greatest temptation to avoid dying on the cross?
Not my desire, but your desire be done.
So the pattern flips, and you have one person resisting temptation, and his suffering provides life for many.
Very cool. Can we do one more?
Totally. How about a big one? How God brings humanity through chaotic waters into a new world. It starts on page 1, where God separates these dark, chaotic waters.
Yeah, dry land emerges as a home for humans to flourish.
Then the pattern reappears with the chaotic waters of the flood. God rescues this remnant, Noah and his family, through the waters so that they can step onto dry land and become humanity 2.0. Now, does that basic storyline remind you of anything else?
Oh, right, the famous Exodus story.
Yeah, exactly. That's when God saves his chosen people from Egypt by leading them through the waters onto dry land.
While Pharaoh and his armies destroyed.
The pattern repeats later with Joshua and the Israelites.
They passed through the waters of the Jordan into the Promised Land.
Yeah, you got it. So now you can see how later biblical authors will project this pattern into the future. Like Isaiah, he hoped for a new Exodus with a new king, leading God's people forward into a new creation. And in this repetition, the nations become the chaotic waters.
So you can see how combining all these patterns brings us to Jesus.
Yeah, notice how all the Gospels highlight that story of Jesus going to the Jordan River. He goes into the waters and back out again.
His baptism.
That's when God announces that Jesus is his son, who will rescue the world from the chaos of our evil and violence by going into death and out the other side. This is why baptism became such a big deal for Jesus' followers. It's about participating in this ancient pattern, going through the waters of death, following Jesus into the new creation.
These design patterns seem really important.
Yeah, they're actually the main way biblical authors have unified these hundreds of stories together. And every pattern develops a core theme throughout the whole biblical story that leads to Jesus.
Great. That's biblical narrative, which makes up over 40% of the Bible. Now, another 30% is made up of ancient poetry.
And learning to read biblical poetry is what we'll explore in the next videos.
Okay, so design patterns. How important do you think they are? Are they just there for show, or do they have a purpose? What also might see some challenges with some of these patterns, as in they're similar, but they're not the same. I tend to think that we often bring a lot of bias when we see biblical patterns, right? Because truthfully, that might depend on how one was taught to see patterns, how one was taught to read these patterns. I have to admit that it was Rabbi David Fohrman that really stretched my thoughts in the realm of biblical patterns. Let me take a step back. Remember my Dusty Feet logo, the animation in the beginning? It's a reveal of that logo that sits on my right, okay? So there's the graphic. Footprints. So footprints, those are just repetitive patterns. Yeah, a little redundant maybe. Okay, but we see a pattern or pattern type story, and we see a repetitive themes in these stories, right? But I want to add a pattern that they didn't cover, kind of like patterns within patterns, like a chiasm, okay? Because a chiasm is it's a fairly simple pattern in a sense, um, because it's the repetition of a similar or related idea, just in reverse sequence, right? ABC, CBA. Truthfully, however, it's the most prevalent pattern in all of Scripture. It literally is in more places than you can imagine and bigger than you might think. Let's start small with Jesus and a few of his teachings, and let's look at a few passages from Matthew, right? So let's start with Matthew 23:12, right? Whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and whoever humbles himself shall be exalted. Exalts himself, humbled, there's a pivot, and then humbles himself, exalted. That's kind of funny, but it seems to fall in line with that something we've been discussing in Outside the Class: first last, last first. So let's look at another pattern in Matthew. It's Matthew 13, verse 15. Listen. For the heart of this people has become dull. With their ears they scarcely hear, and they've closed their eyes. Otherwise, they would see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their heart in return, and I would heal them. So we have a heart dull, ears hear, eyes see. Otherwise, there's your pivot, right? Eyes see, ears hear, heart healed. Let's look at another one, a little bit larger. Again, from Matthew, it's chapter 16, it's verses 16 through 20. You'll recognize this passage. You will know them by their fruits. Grapes are not gathered from thorns, nor figs from thistles. So every good tree bears good fruit. Bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot produce bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot produce good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Then you're going to know them by their fruits. So know them by their fruits. Grapes not from thorns, figs not from thistles. Good tree, good fruit. Bad tree, bad fruit. Pivot. Good does not bear bad. bad does not bear good, not good trees are destroyed. Know them by their fruit. I've learned a lot with my studies with Rabbi Fohrman with chiasms within Scripture, and that they can be very complicated in a sense too, though, because things might flip sometimes. A pattern inside might be flipped, as in A, B, C, D, D, B, C, A. Or maybe the repeating of a pattern that the characters might flip. In one story, it's a man and a woman. Now it's a woman and a man. Or a place of safety might be good in one, but not good in the other. Or maybe the pattern went from bad to good, and now in this one, the pattern goes from good to bad. Those patterns from Jesus, those are simple examples, but yet it shows that he repeats his Father's patterns. So let's take that pattern thought and we're going to expand it. Rabbi Fohrman has a great example. It's found in Exodus. It's an important time in the history of God's interaction with his people. You're going to know the story. Let's take a listen.
There is a fascinating pattern in the text that lurks just underneath the surface of the words, and this pattern extends through the entire second half of the book of Exodus. I want to show you this structure, or at least part of it, and examine some of its fascinating implications with you. So this pattern is an Atbash structure, otherwise known as a chiastic structure. We talked about these kinds of patterns a little bit back in Parshat Lech Lecha and in Parshat Vayera. If you haven't seen those videos, I encourage you to go back and take a quick look. The way an Atbash structure works is that a text is arranged so that its first element mirrors its last element, its second to first element mirrors its second to last element, third to first mirrors third to last, all converging towards the center of the text. Atbash, of course, gets its name from the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Aleph, the first letter of the alphabet, mirroring Taf, the last letter. Beit, the second letter of the alphabet, mirroring Shin, the second to last letter. Academics will call this kind of structure a chiastic structure. So I believe that there is a very elaborate chiastic structure that isn't just a few sentences long, but it's actually about 15 chapters long, and it spans the entire second half of the book of Exodus. I explore this structure in great detail in a series of lectures that's on the audio part of our site, entitled Shattered Tablets and a Calf of Gold. I encourage you to check those out. But let me give you one or two highlights from that here. If you look at the second half of the book of Exodus, starting from chapter 25 or so, the main theme that occupies the text for a number of chapters is the command to build the tabernacle. Now that takes you all the way from chapter 25 through the end of chapter 31. Right after the last commands to build the tabernacle, you get a section of text in which God commands the people to observe the Sabbath. After that, starting with chapter 32, you get the greatest disaster in the book of Exodus, and that is the extended story of the golden calf. So far we have three elements: the construction of the Mishkan, the Sabbath, and the golden calf. But now look at the end of the story of the golden calf. If the story of the golden calf begins with Moses at the top of the mountain, getting tablets of the law that he's supposed to bring down, the story of the golden calf ends with Moses on top of the mountain again, getting a second set of tablets. He had shattered the first ones, and he's there for 40 days and 40 nights, and he's coming down from the mountain again. And that takes place at the end of chapter 34. And just as that story ends, beginning of chapter 35, what do we have? We have a command to keep the Sabbath once again. And then just a few verses later, after that command, we have a long extended section, wouldn't you know it, the actual construction of the Mishkan. So you can begin to see it. Command to build Mishkan, Shabbat, followed by the disaster of the Egel, followed by Shabbat and the actual building of the Mishkan. Now, I've just given you very, very rough parameters for this chiasm, but the truth is if you drill down deeper and actually look into the text, you'll see in each of these sections there are multiple details. And as you look into those details, you'll find the chiastic structure gets played out in the details too. Let me just give you one quick example of that. Look at the transition from the first Shabbat section into the golden calf section. Take a look at that first sentence, chapter 32, verse 1. Vayar ha'am ki boshesh Moshe laredet min ha'ar, and the people saw that Moshe was taking a long time coming down from the mountain. Vayikahel ha'am al Aaron, and they gathered against Aaron, and they demanded from Aaron that he make some sort of replacement for Moses for them. And this, of course, leads to the golden calf. Now look at that phrase, Vayikahel ha'am al Aaron, and the people gathered against Aaron. Now let's play a little game. How many times do you think A word comprised of those particular letters, Vav, Yud, Kuf, He, Lamed, has appeared until now in the Torah. It turns out this is the first appearance of that word. Now let me ask you another question. What do you think is the second occurrence of those letters in the Torah? Well, wouldn't you know it, it's at the exactly corresponding spot on the other side of the Chiasm. Let's look at the transition away from the golden calf story going into the second Shabbat command. Take a look at chapter 35, verse 1. After Moshe successfully comes down from the mountain, Vayakel Moshe, Moshe gathers the people and tells them, this is what you must do, observe the Sabbath. It's the very same letters, Vav, Yud, Kuf, He, and Lamed, pronounced differently this time, Vayakel, a play off of Vayikahel. So the very first times we ever have this combination of letters, it all takes place at exactly corresponding points in this Chiasm. And if you think about it, one Vav Yud Kuf He Lamed is the exact mirror image of the other. The people had just been commanded about the Sabbath, but Moshe was on top of the mountain and the people thought he was lost forever. So they gathered against Aaron and demanded a replacement for Moshe. But the second time you have these letters, it's a success. Moshe is back at the bottom of the mountain, and it is Moshe who gathers the people and commands them about how they must observe the Sabbath. So that's just a little example of the kind of detail which exists when you really drill down and see what's happening on the verse-by-verse level. But now let me take you to the edges of the Chiasm. The thing you could always ask in a Chiasm is how far does it go? What are its outer edges? If you look at the current edges of the Chiasm, the command to construct the Mishkan on the one hand and the actual construction on the other, let's ask, does the Chiasm extend even further? Which is to say, does the event that precedes the first command to construct the Mishkan mirror the event that follows the actual construction of the Mishkan? Okay, so right after the Mishkan is constructed, chapter 40 in the book of Exodus, end of verse 33, Vayichal Moshe et hamlacha, and Moshe finished all the work of the creation of the Mishkan, and then Vayichas ha'anan et ol moed, and then the cloud of the divine presence came down and descended upon the Mishkan, uchvod Hashem malei et Mishkan, and the glory of God filled the Mishkan. Now let's go back and look. What happens at the corresponding place in the Chiasm on the other side? In other words, what happens right before the first command to construct the Mishkan? Let's look at the end of chapter 24. Vayal Moshe lahar, and Moshe went up the mountain, and look what we have. Another cloud. Vayichas ha'anan et ahar. The cloud of God's presence covered the mountain, Mount Sinai. Vayishkon kvod Hashem al har Sinai, and the glory of God goes and ensconces itself on top of Mount Sinai. Fascinating. At the two ends of this Chiasm, we have two cloud sections, the cloud of God's presence. In one case, God's presence resting on Mount Sinai. In the other case, God's presence resting inside the tabernacle. Now let's zoom in a little bit closer on these two end sections and see if in the details they correspond to each other. Let's go to the first section in chapter 24. There's this cloud on top of Mount Sinai. Vayichaseu anan sheshet yamim, and the cloud was there for 6 days. And then Vayikra el Moshe bayom hashvi mitoch hanan. God called to Moshe on the 7th day from inside the cloud. Umar'eh kvod Hashem ka'esh ochelet b'rosh hahar. And the glory of God was like consuming fire on the top of the mountain. Le'enei b'nei Israel, in the eyes of all the people of Israel. They saw this incredible image of intimidating, burning fire. And then, miraculously, Vayavo Moshe b'toch ha'anan. Moses went into this cloud. Now, do we have anything that reminds us of all of this on the other side of the Chiasm? It turns out that remarkably, we do. If you look carefully, just at the corresponding spot at the other side of the Chiasm, on its outer edge, we have another cloud story. The cloud of God's presence is back. And once again, Moses attempts to encounter it. Vayichas ha'anan et ol moed. This time, the cloud comes down and covers something, but it doesn't cover a mountain. A mountain is a natural feature of the world, something that God made in creation. Now the cloud comes, and it covers something that man made. It covers the tabernacle. Ukvod Hashem malei et Mishkan, and just like before, the glory of God was at the top of the mountain, resting on top of the mountain. Here it's not resting anywhere. It's inside. The glory of God fills the tabernacle. And now we encounter something surprising. Moshe, as he did before at the top of the mountain, tries to encounter God. V'lo yachol Moshe lavo el ol moed. And Moshe was not able to go into the Mishkan, ki shachan alav ha'anan, because the cloud was there. Do you see what's happening? The holiness of God in the tabernacle is so intense that Moshe can't even enter the tabernacle. The text is going out of its way to compare the tabernacle experience to the Sinai experience, and it is saying that however much God was present at Sinai, that was just a drop in the ocean of the intensity of God's presence at the tabernacle. Not even Moshe could enter. It's a stunning victory for the Jewish people. In the golden calf, God had said, "I dare not come inside you lest I destroy you." Bit by bit, the Jewish people had built back their relationship with God until this crowning moment when God would come and dwell in their presence with such intensity that it dwarfs the actual Sinai experience itself. And where is God this time? Not at the top of the God-made mountain, but inside the man-made structure. God has come down into our world. And now there's one more point of correspondence: the fire. Do you remember the fire the first time? God had called to Moshe from the cloud, and the cloud was like fire, fire that was consuming fire, that was intimidating. And the entire people stood back upon gazing at the fire. Now, one more time at the end of the Chiasm, there's fire, but it's a different kind of fire. Balot hanan me'al mishkan, when the cloud would lift from the top of the tabernacle. It would be a sign that it was time for the Jews to travel. Yitzu b'nei Yisrael b'chol ma'aseh, and the Jews would travel. V'im lo ya'aleh hanan, but if the cloud would not lift, they would stay where they are. Ki anan Hashem ala mishkan yomam, because the cloud was there for the Jews by day. Ve'esh tia layla bo, and at night it turned into fire. Leinei kol beit Yisrael, in the eyes of all the Jewish people. One more time, there's a cloud and there's fire. One more time it happens, Leinei b'nei Yisrael, in the eyes of all the people. The first time, it was a fiery cloud. Now, the two phenomenon, fire and cloud, separate. There's a cloud by day, there's fire by night. And before, whereas this image was just intimidating, that caused us to stand back from afar in awe, now it's gentle and benevolent. The cloud leads us, tells us where to go and when, and the fire illuminates the night and provides guidance, comfort, and light. As intense is the holiness of God in the tabernacle, and it is more intense than Sinai. Now, after the golden calf, after the relationship between God and the Jews has finally been repaired, the presence of God is there as a kind, gentle force. It provides for the Jews. It leads them. It shows them where to go. It gives them light and security. God, the being from beyond, is there for us in our world, in the place that we made for him, and his presence is there to take care of us.
Hi, thanks for watching. I'm Emu and I'm the COO here at Aleph Beta. If you enjoyed watching these videos, please share with others. Right over here. Share. Thank you.
So these patterns, right, they can really be interesting, right? And they can really help us connect so many things to see these relationships to other things we haven't seen before. Just in case you're interested on how far these patterns can go in Scripture, how wide and how tall is this tapestry, there's a link in the description to a discussion between Rabbi David Fohrman and Rabbi David Schwartz, right? In that discussion, fair warning, it's about an hour and a half, and that's part one. Rabbi David Schwartz, he proposes the idea that a large portion of the Torah is a giant chiasm, Genesis and Exodus. It's interesting because the center of that story is around Judah and Tamara. Oh, also interesting in Rabbi Schwartz's research that it was a part of a Christian study with this that made this story in the center stand out. When I read it, it seems to me to be it pointing to the Messiah. But why shouldn't I be surprised? So I, again, highly recommend that you go back and reread that story. I think you might find it interesting. But if you make it the end of the video, right, there's a statement from Rabbi Fohrman that you also might find interesting. You know, like Tim and John pointed out, patterns are there, and they're all over the place. Rabbi Fohrman and Rabbi Schwartz take us to maybe the connecting all of those patterns that Tim and John are talking about. If you listen to what I just said, you'll see a chiasm can work. Patterns are there, So peek around. You might, just might, see more than you thought. So our next part in the viewing of the biblical narrative will be the gospel. It's not poetry, like they mentioned, because it actually go to another episode called the gospel. So then that should be interesting. Yeah. So our point to ponder for the evening. And this is going to take us back to, this graphic is actually from the center of Rabbi Schwartz's Chiasm. It might be tough to read. You might have to zoom in on this later, right? Pull it up. But the center, and this is just a little bit of this is huge, tall PDF document. The link to this document is on TheDustyFeet.com on the page that covers this episode. There's a link to this document that you can have, okay? And it's quite long. It gets all the pieces of the puzzle. This is the center of the center of the center, okay? And that little black thing in the middle is the center. The encounter of Yehuda and Tamar, where Tamar conceives the future leadership. Read the whole story that wraps around that, all that purple in there. And I think you'll find it an interesting, challenging story, but I think you'll find some more points to ponder. And thanks for with us tonight on another episode of The Dusty Feet.